This e-lecture is part of Pearson's professional development series for first-year writing instructors.
I'm Scott Warnock from Drexel University. I'm going to discuss the use of message boards and other asynchronous technologies. First of all, I want to define what I mean by a message board. Essentially, these are web-based discussion forums in which the participants, the students, will post written messages, although you can include other media. I'm just going to focus on writing for this brief presentation. And that material is available to all the other participants in the class. These technologies and the way that I'm going to discuss them are interesting because they're asynchronous, and that means that all the students are not logged in at the same time, but instead they kind of can contribute to the conversations when on their own time. All learning management systems have some form of message board application, so it's a ubiquitous technology and an easy one to use for teachers. I think that it opens up a number of writing opportunities in the classroom, and that's what I wanted to focus on, talking a little bit about some of the general philosophies behind the use of message boards, and then to conclude with some specific strategies and even a few specific assignments that you can use. The message board text, it differs a bit from the standard text where a student writes some kind of formalized paper or project or report to an instructor in a number of ways. One of those ways is that the message board text, and to me it's more conversational in nature. The essence of it is that it's happening in a kind of dialogic setting, not just between the student and the instructor, of course, but between the student, among all the students and the instructor. Also, the message board text is created in an environment with multiple audiences, and ideally it accounts for those audiences. So the text itself is conscious of audience at every turn, and that provides opens up a number of opportunities that I think, in addition to being to opening up different rhetorical challenges, probably better replicate the kind of the writing that students are going to do in the future in their careers. Also, the message board texts are semi-formal. In them, the writers pay more attention to detail, grammar, mechanics, and things like that than they would in a normal chat or text environment. But the occasional grammatical slip or even some internet-based shorthand is acceptable as long as it sustains the kind of dialogic liveliness of web communications. I actually define these as semi-formal, italicizing that word on my syllabus so students understand that this is a kind of different type of text, not quite what I would require in a paper, but not as loose as it might be when they're just texting or chatting with their friends. Also, these texts are topic-focused. Students typically write a message board text in response to a specific topic, question, or train of thought. They normally stay within that kind of realm and then branch out throughout the course of a conversation that's encouraged not only, again, by the teacher, but by the kind of responses that students get. In fact, in light of that, I think that one thing is that teachers have to be careful not to become too controlling of the conversation early on, because it's truly an organic type textual experience, and that the texts grow and evolve in ways that are difficult, if not impossible, to anticipate from the instructor's stance. Also, these, as I mentioned, the texts are rhetorically focused. The writer not only has a clear purpose, and I mean most texts do. We know the purpose of writing in scholastic settings, but the text and the writer also has a clear occasion for writing. The writing is clear between students and teachers because the students are actually taking part in a conversation and often defending points, making statements in a context that involves, and I use quotation marks around this, real writing. So there are just some ideas in general that kind of govern my use of these type of texts in my classes. I should say that while I teach a great deal of hybrid and online courses, that these message board texts are completely applicable in face-to-face environments, and in fact can be used in a number of ways to kind of bridge, carry over, sustain conversations that took place in an on-site class to the online environment and vice versa. Now, some of the specific practices that I use, for the purposes of this, I think perhaps of most interest to you, the listener, would be specific ways that I use these texts. So one thing that I do, and I'll go through kind of a little mini list here, is I use posts as evidence. students often, I've been interested in having students draw from each other's ideas as evidence in my courses for a long time. In on-site teaching, I would sometimes ask students to draw from comments that were actually made in the class, although of course that required the students to be pretty sharp journalists, transcribers to make this happen. I think that I employ this practice much more effectively with the use of message boards. In formal writing projects in my course, I ask students to use their colleagues' posts for evidence. As in the face-to-face classes, I think this kind of enhances participation in the boards because it encourages students to read and post more carefully, and in some cases actually to attempt to generate conversation around areas of interest to their projects. There's also a number of other kind of writing advantages to weaving posts into their own writing. They must juxtapose their colleagues' comments with that of other evidence, and I think it also raises some interesting authority issues. I always like to think about the experience of when one of my students is peer reviewing another student's paper and comes across his or her own comments as evidence in that paper. I should add, too, that this can also add, in a way, to the authenticity of student writing. I know that many teachers are seeking obstacles to student plagiarism, and I think that the use of texts in this way it can be a help. By using texts embedded in the class, they simply have to be involved in the class in some way. Sure, I guess they could still purchase a paper, but they would have some work ahead in creating context for the evidence from the class boards within that paper. So that's one way I use text. Another assignment that I give students in this environment is the use of what I call post-proofs. And we can do this, of course, with their more formalized writing as well, but what I ask them to do is to review several of their own posts, proof them, and then write an accompanying meta-commentary for those posts. Now, a number of thinkers in composition, starting with Peter Elba perhaps, say that we, as writers, we need to be tolerant of our own mistakes. And I know we want students to rethink and revise texts, but especially once we graded them, and especially if it's high stakes, I think that that's asking a lot of students. In the message board environment, they write thousands and thousands of low stakes words in the course of a term. And that environment, by its very nature, may be more conducive to that kind of revision learning that we want. So students, maybe it removes that fear of finding a mistake that students might have when they look back at something that's already been graded. They've got tons and tons of material to work from and to look back and see how they've operated in this kind of multi-audience communicative environment. Another assignment I use is called My Favorite Poster, and this works out quite well in my course where I have students normally at the midpoint at the end of the term, I use this. The first post at midpoint is, the first thread is called My Favorite Post, where I ask them to look back over the message boards from the term up to that point and to pick out one really great post, like their favorite post from the term, and then to describe why it was their favorite. There's a number of advantages to this, of course. It helps, it's kind of a nice way for them to pay it back throughout the course of the term to the students they really admire, and I think that's great for those students. It also helps other students to see what's been identified by the class, not just by me, but by the class as outstanding work. At the end of the term, I tweak this slightly, and I call it My Favorite Poster. And what I ask them to do for this mini assignment is to go back and look through the whole corpus of work of one poster and to say who that poster is, to use some demonstrate that person's skill by citing a number of quotes, and then to provide further evidence as to why that person was the best poster of the term in their opinion. And I think that this, helps them reflect on what about writing appeals to them. Clarity, diction, humor, evidence. What is it about writing that they think is important? And as I said, it also kind of brings, at the end of the term, a really nice classroom environment where the students, are building kind of camaraderie and complimenting each other for work that in most cases is extremely well done. And I always tend to agree with their choices for best post and best posters. Another assignment I use is, and I think it worked well in this asynchronous message board environment, is what I call writing puzzles. Because we write so much, and I say we because I include myself with this, I'll often just cut and paste a line or two from a post, and I'll put it on a separate thread that I've named writing puzzles throughout the term. And what I ask students to do is to then look at that, writing puzzle, and through this mechanism to get at some of the grammatical mechanical issues through live writing in the class. I even cut and paste, and I deliberately do this something that I've written that has, a punctuation mistake or something like faulty predication, some kind of nuanced grammatical mechanical error. And the students often really take off on this. They will write several screens kind of analyzing the problem, what they think it is, and we'll have a conversation. I try to pick something from everybody over the course of the term so no one's singled out. And it's a nice way, I think, of interjecting a bit of the kind of mechanical, grammatical instruction that we want to have in the course using their actual writing. I also use another assignment where I have them look at specifics of the writing process. And what I do with those kind of threads is I ask them questions. For instance, like one is I'll have the subject line, share your secrets. And I'll share a little bit of my research process and then ask them to, in again, this conversational environment, to describe some things that they do in their research process. And this might sound like a kind of not very thrilling type thread, but it's amazing what they write. I've often, in fact, been so taken by the way they describe their own process that I've taken the best of them, put them all into one file, and kind of packaged them as a gift for the students at the end of the term. I'll give them all like this gift of here's what your colleagues said were the best, their best practices essentially in research. You can create posts like this about how they read, their writing process, how they develop a topic. Again, I think that the environment, the message board environment, is really conducive to this. They could actually, of course, write these in mini assignments that they hand in. They're not as easy to share as in the message board environment. You could have this conversation in class, but of course, students can't refer back to it because it's preserved in the message board environment. Maybe just a couple other things in terms of some short assignments and strategies that I use. And some of them can be kind of fun. One is called Challenge the Persona. And what I'll do is I'll create an alternate personality that's not, Professor Warnock in the class. I often use the name Dr. Logo Etho in my argument classes, and I'll have this person and I'll sign on in this role as the, instructors can sign on as a student in the class. So I'll sign on as a student and use this personality of Dr. Logo Etho, who'll come and make exaggerated claims or outlandish arguments, often without evidence, using logical fallacies, debating strictly from emotional stances. And what I have the students basically debate this personality. And what I ask them to do, I try to goad them into making, themselves losing their temper on the boards, or perhaps, just kind of Dr. Logo Etho's arguments are so ridiculous sometimes. But I ask the students to maintain their cool, to seek the logical flaws, to use evidence, to debate this personality. And it's a very interesting environment because they're not really arguing with the teacher anymore. So they don't have to feel like they're going to be wrong, they're going to hurt my feelings. And I have to say, it's a lot of fun for me. As I post on this, I really kind of stretch it as much as I can into the outlandish. And the students really, I think, feel some sense of accomplishment when they finally, and they almost always do, take down Dr. Logo Etho. The final thing I guess I'd mention is just kind of general strategy about peer review. And peer review is a cornerstone of my teaching pedagogy, as I imagine it is to many other people who teach first-year writing and other writing courses. But with the use of message boards, again, in this asynchronous environment, it takes message board out of the classroom and puts it in this electronic environment. And I think that the class itself becomes an ongoing kind of peer review. I mean, there's a number of ways you can actually use peer review on message boards, and that material is handled in other areas, and I won't get into it here. But with the use of these conversational discussion posts where, the teacher serves as some sort of moderator, I think that it varies how much you want to interject in those conversations. Some people take the extreme of not being a part of them at all. Other people respond to every post. I take somewhat of a middle ground. I try to, as a rule of thumb, post 1 out of every 4 posts on the discussions by the end of the term, which is still a good bit of work on my part. But the peer review philosophy becomes embedded in the whole course because students are constantly looking at each other's writing, thinking about each other's ideas, and responding to them. So this is probably a good kind of overarching way of thinking about the use of message boards in this environment, where students have the opportunity to be consistently thinking about not just their own writing, not just the writing that they see in texts that are official for the course, the books and so forth, but the writing of their peers, the kind of process-oriented material that is changing throughout the term. And they notice a lot how people have sharpened up their ability to make arguments in this controlled environment. So I think that's a kind of summary of a few. There's obviously a tremendous amount of things you can do in this environment that you can have some, challenge students, have some fun, and again, based on the idea that these discussions, these message board conversations take place in a measured way in an asynchronous environment where students are spending their time doing a lot of writing, reading, and thinking about what each other has to say. In terms of grading this material, just to close here, my advice for this would be straightforward, and that is don't be the bottleneck in the process. If you want your students to write, this is a tremendous environment to help them do that. They can write, as I said, thousands of extra words over the course of the term. But if you become obsessed about grading every aspect of every post, you'll burn out and you'll end up paring down these informal writing opportunities because there'll be too much to grade. And of course, that defeats the whole purpose. Using grades in this environment on some kind of holistic scale. I actually do grade every post, but it doesn't mean I read every post looking for comma splices and things like that. I read them and I enjoy them actually, but I grade them on a 10-point simple scale that that the students and I come to a quick understanding about what that scale means, of the numbers from 1 to 10. So I think that the number of grades alone in an environment like this, or the kind of holistic approach you might take, creates a risk-tolerant writing environment for students in which they can learn to expand what they do with their writing. I think the key is just to not overvaluate their posts and to let them write. So I think that as I want to close here, ultimately message boards allow you to logistically to do a number of things that writing teachers strive to do in a writing class. They allow you to share text easily. They allow you to have students write to multiple audiences. They allow you to have students take risks in a course. And I think that really only your teacher's imagination in terms of specific assignments and strategies restricts you.
For additional e-lectures, visit Pearson's professional development site for first-year writing instructors at www.pearsonhighered.com/compro.